The Swing. Written by Dan David. Narrated by Jeff Clement. What do people usually fear when moving out to live on their own? What sort of problems does one normally encounter when finally venturing from the safety of their parents' home into a place of their own? Perhaps it's paying their rent on time, or having to do all the cleaning without any of Mommy's help. These were the things I anticipated. I never could have predicted the events of the past week. We had finally moved the last box into my new house. Single-level ranch and only 2 bedrooms, but for a bachelor like me, it was a dream come true. The house was right in the heart of a great suburban neighborhood with a 2-car driveway and a pretty big backyard. When I had seen the yard, the first thing I thought of was all the parties I'd be hosting. I stepped onto the deck and took a breath of fresh air while closing my eyes to imagine the endless nights of friends, booze, and of course, women. I stretched my arms out and let out an exuberant sigh of relief. As I scanned my surroundings, I couldn't help but notice the elevated deck gave me the proper vantage point to see into my neighbors' backyards. I figured since I hadn't formally met any of them yet, I would try and guess now whom I'd have to worry about if my parties got too rowdy and the risk of 911 calls would become a harsh reality. To my right, I saw a vibrant garden, a grill, and a hammock. I figured it was a middle-aged couple. Hopefully they're not too old and cranky, I thought to myself as I turned my head to view my neighbors to the left. And that's when I saw him. Under a large oak tree, adorned in colorful Christmas lights, was what looked to be a young boy swinging away on his playset. Great, I thought. I bet his bedtime is a lot earlier than any party I throw would be ending. I continued to look at the boy. His back was turned to me. He wore a hoodie and gloves, which struck me as odd since it was summer and pretty warm outside. I brushed it off and assumed the boy was sick. I went back inside and began to unpack everything. With the help of some friends, we managed to put together all my furniture, hook up my home entertainment system, and more or less get the house in working order. I just sent out the text, guys. Get ready to party tonight, I exclaimed as I leaped off the couch and finished my beer. The guys all began to cheer and a round of high fives were exchanged. By now, the sun was setting, as it had been several hours since we had first brought in all my belongings. My friend Dan was unpacking one of the last boxes as he eagerly looked out of the window.
Have you met your neighbors yet? Any fine young ladies gonna be coming around here asking to borrow some sugar?
He asked in a sarcastic tone as he turned to me with a lewd gesture. Smiling and walking over, I replied, "No, not yet, but I don't think I'll have much luck in that department. From the looks of it, it's just a bunch of normal families. One of them even has a kid." As I pointed to the house I had seen earlier, my face scrunched to show a look of confusion and surprise. The boy I had seen swinging earlier was still there. He was still swinging under the ambience of the lit-up tree. Weird. That kid was swinging when we first got here, too, I said to Dan as he looked at his phone. Barely acknowledging my comment, he raised his hand up and mumbled,
Must be a special ed kid or something.
He walked off, calling more people to invite them to the housewarming party. I turned back to the swinging boy. He couldn't have been swinging this whole time, could he? That night, as planned, we had my housewarming party. It was such a great time. I greeted my friends and cousins as they arrived, handing them all the beverage of their choice. We were outside until around 3 or 4 in the morning when the weather suddenly got cool and it began to drizzle. I would have been willing to stick it out until it passed, but the girls all began to freak out, claiming their hair would frizz, and they all ran inside. Naturally, the guys followed, holding makeshift umbrellas over the girls' heads. I laughed to myself at how hard they were trying to get lucky. I took the opportunity to quickly clean up some of the trash that had accumulated before going inside. I scooped up a bunch of cans and bottles before I turned around and was left in awe. I guess we were all distracted by the music and alcohol to notice earlier, but now, with everyone inside, I saw it. The boy was still outside and on his swing. He was still in the same position and outfit I'd seen him in all day, back turned to me, wearing the same hoodie and gloves. I stood there for a minute, lost in thought, when from behind me I heard a loud, "Hiya, neighbor." I jumped and did a quick 180, dropping the trash I'd been carrying.
Oh, sorry about that, bud. Didn't mean to startle ya,
laughed an elderly man. He was wearing pajamas and slippers as he held his hand out, waiting for a shake on my end. "Oh, hello, sir," I said as I cleared my throat and shook his hand, collecting my thoughts. He smiled and began to fumble with his hands.
I hate to be that guy, especially since, you just moved in and everything, but you think you guys can turn down the music a bit? My wife and I are pretty light sleepers, and at this age, we tend to be early risers, he said bashfully.
I smiled and laughed as I put my hand to my face in embarrassment. Geez, I'm sorry, sir. I guess things got a little crazier than planned. I didn't think people would stick around this long. I really did feel bad. I half expected the man to come out yelling, demanding us to keep it down lest he call the cops. His gentle demeanor was refreshing, and I was more than happy to oblige. I laughed and replied, I'll go let everyone know that they need to stay inside and take it down a notch. I'm Peter, by the way. I shook his hand.
Pleasure to meet you, Peter. I'm Paul,
he said with a grin. As he smiled, his eyes drifted past mine and towards the swinging boy.
I assume you've noticed the Langers kid by now, huh?
Asked Paul as he cupped his hands and breathed into them to try to keep warm. Yeah, I said as I turned to face him. What's the deal with him? He's been on that thing all day. Paul shrugged.
Not sure. No one really knows the story. He just swings and swings until eventually...
Paul stopped and his eyes widened.
Wait, it's happening. Check it out.
I turned around to find the boy had stopped swinging. He sat completely still for a moment before slowly rising from the rubber seat of the swing. He began to shake violently, falling to his knees and scraping the dirt below him. Even from where we were standing, we were able to hear his quick bursts of shrieking and gurgling. I became concerned. Was the boy okay? It looked like he was having an asthma attack or a seizure. I started to run to the boy in order to help, but stopped after a couple of steps. His mother had run out. I looked at her, completely sober now from the adrenaline that was pumping through my body. It was not a pleasant sight. She was a frail, haggard woman with a gray, knotted mane of hair on her head. Her skin was pale and her eyes had dark bags underneath. It looked as if she hadn't slept or had a proper meal for ages. Mrs. Langer rushed out quick, holding a small, orange bottle, the kind one would receive from a pharmacist. After she reached her boy, she knelt down and poured several white pills into her hand. Before she could even finish offering the pills to her son, he had grabbed her arm and buried his face into the palm of her hand, inhaling the pills. Mrs. Langer pulled away and began to rub her wrist. It appeared the boy had hurt her, which did not really surprise me due to how skinny the woman was. Paul and I watched intensely without uttering a single word. After a moment or two, the boy simply rose back to his feet, sat back down on his swing, and resumed his leisurely activity. Mrs. Langer grabbed the now empty orange bottle and proceeded back inside, still clutching her wrist. Paul and I were both shaken up. We had no idea what we had just seen.
Wow, I've seen the boys spaz out before, but never that bad. I bet whatever condition he has is getting more severe. Poor kid,
Paul said as he rubbed the back of his head. What? What exactly is wrong with him? I asked, with my eyes still glued to the child.
Like I said, I don't know. No one around here does,
Paul replied, turning around and walking back to his door.
Anyway, my wife is probably getting worried. You have a good night, Peter.
Yeah, I sighed, arranging my thoughts. Nice meeting you, Paul. We both exchanged a final wave and returned to our respective households. The party was dying down when I entered, and I was glad. What I had just seen took a lot out of me. The next morning I felt like shit. The copious waves of alcohol I had carelessly consumed the night prior had finally caught up to me. My head throbbed and I was severely parched. I stood up and the arid sensation in my mouth and throat was quickly replaced by feelings of nausea. I scrambled to the bathroom and dropped to my knees, clutching the porcelain for dear life. Oh, at least I have the day off to recover, I thought to myself. I grabbed the sports drink I had strategically placed in the bathroom the day before in anticipation for my hangover and chugged it down in only a few gulps. I was no stranger to this feeling, and I knew what to expect. Within a couple of minutes, I began to vomit and immediately felt better, though not enough to have a very productive day. I mentally prepared myself for a day of movies, video games, and junk food. After a couple of hours of lying in my borderline vegetative state, I heard the mailman make his stop at my door. In no mood to get off the couch, I ignored it and continued binge-watching the zombie show everybody was raving about. It was probably not the best idea to be observing such grotesque gore while it felt as if a war was being waged in my stomach. I sucked it up and continued to watch. Several episodes later, I made my way to the kitchen and popped in a giant TV dinner into the microwave. While it cooked, I decided I would bring in the mail from earlier. I unlocked the front door and let in some much-needed fresh air. I stood at the door and scooped up the contents of my mailbox, sifting through the junk mail and the bills when I saw I'd received a package. Without scanning the box for more details, I brought the small box inside and cut off the tape. I opened it only to find a small orange bottle, like the one I'd seen my neighbor holding last night. I was puzzled and searched for the mailing label on the box. The mailman had delivered it to the wrong house. Annoyed, I let out a big sigh. I was not in the mood to get dressed and leave the house for anything, let alone awkwardly meet new neighbors in order to tell them I have the pills for their weirdo son. I looked out of my back window and saw the boy was swinging away as usual. I heard my microwave go off, indicating my food was ready. With one last glance at the child, I told myself the pills can wait, as the boy had scarfed down several the night before. I tossed the bottle of pills aside and made my way to the kitchen. After eating, I felt fatigued, which caused me to fall asleep on the couch. I woke up from my sleep to the sound of commotion outside my home. The repetitive beeping of a large vehicle in reverse echoed through my brain. Nightfall had arrived, and my house was engulfed in almost absolute darkness. The only light I could see was a dull gray from my now idle television, and the swirl of red and blue illuminating through my windows. The scene that I awoke to was almost surreal, and I thought for a moment that I was dreaming. I got on my feet and I looked through my front window. A crowd had gathered on my front lawn. They were facing the ambulance that was parked in the driveway of the Langer house. I threw on a light coat to hide my stained, most likely rancid-smelling shirt I had been stewing in all day. In the crowd, Paul stood amongst several other people who I presumed to be residents of the neighborhood. "Hey, Paul," I blurted as I cleared the phlegm from my throat. "What the hell is going on?" With his eyes still glued to the scene that unfolded next door, he replied, "Well, we're not exactly sure. We think something may have happened to someone in the house. Mr. Langer is speaking with one of the paramedics and he looks panicked." I saw the man Paul was referring to. Like his wife, Mr. Langer also looked as if his body was depleted and barren. He wore a loose tank top that showed just how skinny he was. His ribs poked through the pale, tight skin on his torso. He was pacing around frantically, covering his eyes and mumbling something to himself. I was still gazing at the distraught man when the soft murmuring of the crowd around me erupted into a frenzy of screams and cries. I turned to the door of the Langer house, and dread began to fill my body. 2 policemen exited the house, followed by a paramedic who wheeled out a gurney. Atop of the gurney was the bloodied body of the seemingly lifeless Mrs. Langer. from where we were standing, we were able to see the pale, bruised wrist of the poor woman hanging from the side, blood running down and dripping from her fingertips. It began to twitch and her head bobbed around as the paramedic pressed an oxygen mask to her face and hoisted the gurney into the back of the ambulance. I turned to Paul, who was standing on the tip of his feet in order to see over the crowd. One of the policemen made his way over to our now frantic group of screaming men and women, ordering us to disperse and return to our homes. Everyone began to bombard the officer with questions, asking what happened and if they were safe.
You have nothing to worry about, people. It appears a group of coyotes attacked Mrs. Langer in her backyard. We've since located and neutralized the animals,
remarked the officer, avoiding eye contact with anyone before him. It was clear he was lying through his teeth. I raised my hand and shouted above the crowd, "And what about the boy? Was he hurt?" The officer shot me a look of irritation and cleared his throat as he hesitantly announced,
He was not anywhere near the scene of the attack. We assume he got scared and ran away for safety, and we're in the process of looking for the child. If anyone sees him, please call 911 immediately.
With that, the officer turned his back to the less than satisfied crowd and almost ran back to his cruiser. I turned to Paul, who bared a look of dismay. He turned and shot an apathetic smile before patting me on the back and making his way inside. I stood there for a moment, after the crowd slowly disbanded. Was this my fault? Did it have something to do with the pills? I quickly disregarded the paranoid thoughts that plagued my mind and walked back to my home. I slid through the front door that I had carelessly left ajar and shut it behind me as I slid down and cupped my hands around my head. There was a legion of emotions coursing through me as I pondered my next move. I knew I had to get the pills out of my house. Though the chances were slim, I did not want any blame being directed at me for not returning the pills sooner. Hell, I knew I had committed at least one federal crime when I unknowingly opened somebody else's mail. I decided I would anonymously place the box of pills in the Langer's mailbox and dash back inside. I grabbed the pills from my couch and glanced out of the back window. The Christmas lights in the oak tree were as bright as ever, illuminating the grisly crime scene that lay just below. Blood and ripped clothing veiled the ground. That's when I saw them. The boy's gloves and hoodie were lying amongst the carnage. My heart sank. I was sure the boy was dead, or at the very least, critically injured. Tears began to fill my eyes as I banged my fists on the windowsill. The sudden burst of sound emanated throughout my home. I hadn't made a peep since I entered. The sudden contrast in sound made the shameful silence that followed even more noticeable. In the midst of the grim silence, I heard it. The low, spine-tingling gurgle that flowed from my bedroom. I froze, barely breathing. I listened keenly for another sound. To my dismay, I heard it again. Another disgusting gurgle, now louder and fiercer, almost like a growl. The lights in my home were still all off, aside from the weak aura that radiated from the idle television. I was frozen still. My body rebelled against my mind's desire to move. Instinct began to kick in as my eyes adjusted to the darkness and fight or flight became a quick reality. I did not know what was in my house. All I knew was I was definitely going to choose flight. I pulled out my phone and fumbled for the flashlight app as I took a step towards my back door. My eyes were glued to the short hallway that connected the main area of the house to my bedroom. That's when I saw it. A small creature began to crawl from the hallway. I could barely make out any of its features. It looked human, but on all fours. The way it moved was eerie and awkward. The appendages moved sloppily and its head was to the ground. I heard the same terrifying gurgle from the creature and realized it was sniffing the floor. And what happened next still fills me with dread when I look back. The flashlight app I had opened had finished loading up and powered on through the phone. The bright light pierced the darkness and lit up the monstrous figure. I felt sick. Do you ever get the feeling in the middle of a nightmare where you start to suspect you aren't in reality and you're begging yourself to wake up? That desperate feeling of despair coursed through every fiber of my being. In front of me stood the Langer boy. Without all the layers of clothing he usually wore, I was able to see him for what he really was. This was not a normal child. His skin was tattered and worn out. Wrinkles and scars embellished his body. He slowly raised his head to the source of the light. Our eyes met. His eyes were the worst part. However intense the darkness around his mother's eyes were, they could not compete with the boy's. The black around his peepers only worked to showcase his dilated pupils and the unnatural color of the irises. I might as well have been made of stone. All my ability to move had completely ceased. I could only stand there and watch the situation unfold before me. The boy slowly turned his body in my direction and began to take steps closer and closer. He left bloody prints where his hands met with the wood grain of my floor. It was not long until he was less than a foot from me. For what seemed like an eternity, he did not move. Neither of us did. My mind was warped in panic, and I thought I would pass out. Before I had the chance, the boy rose from his animal-like posture. He was now standing on his feet, arms dangling to his sides. His eyes peered into mine. I stared back, still paralyzed with fear. He began to sluggishly turn his focus from my eyes to my hand, the one that still clutched a bottle of the pills. As soon as he realized what I held, he broke the silence and let out a demonic shriek like that of a banshee. Only his mouth moved as his jaw dropped. This awoke me from my trance and I fell down, still facing the boy. He crouched so that his face met mine. His mouth was still agape, exposing his sharp, mangled teeth. The tiny razor still contained small shreds of what I assumed to be his mother's flesh. He stretched his arm toward me and unraveled his blood-stained hand. Instantly, I knew what he was after. You, my voice trembled. You want your pills, right? He continued to stare at me, unwavered by my question. I lifted up my hand and began to open the small orange bottle. With shaking hands, I poured several pills into the palm of the child. I waited for a minute. I did not know time could move so slowly. I just wanted him to leave. Eventually, the boy's mouth shut and curled into a faint smile. He turned and made his way to the back door. He shot one final glance over to me as he tilted his head back and consumed all the pills I had given him. With an audible gulp, he pushed open the door and wandered back to his sanctuary. I watched as the boy took a seat on his swing and began to sway forward and backward like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I managed to shut my back door before collapsing to the ground. It's been a week since that night, and I've returned the pills as planned. Mrs. Langer is still in critical condition, and now her husband has taken over, feeding the mysterious pills to his son whenever he needs them. I was never questioned by anyone about what transpired that night. I did not report the incident. I plan to move out soon. Maybe to an apartment in the city where there are no yards or playsets. The nightmares and fear from that night have run rampant in my mind. My backyard is still a mess from the party. I have not dared to go back there in order to clean things up. This is due to the fact that, since that fearful night, the boy makes sure to swing, facing my home. Whenever I even glance out of the window, I see his haunting eyes peering into mine as he smiles that horrid smile. The last I saw of the boy was his father coming out to give him another dose of the medication. Mr. Langer was down to his last bottle. That was 3 long nights ago. I'm looking out of the window now to see what I expected to see. An empty swing.
Warwood Elementary. Written by Michael Guidry. Performed by Nick Goroff.
I honestly don't know where to begin. I'll start with the basic stuff. My name is Alex. I'm 22 years old. From 1999 till 2003, I attended a small elementary school in Georgia called Warwood Elementary. It was a private but non-religious school, around maybe 300 kids total at the time. I was an only child, and my parents were divorced. I never saw my dad after the split, and my mom engaged a new boyfriend, but they never married, just stayed engaged. Anyways, I don't remember my first year at Warwood very clearly, as I was in kindergarten. I made a friend named Tony, and we stuck together up until I moved in 2004. I'm not going to waste your time with useless details about my life, though. I'm going to tell you about the weird stuff. First grade, the year 2000. Tony and I were in Miss Anderson's class. She was in her 30s, had short hair, kind of looked like Jamie Lee Curtis in her later years. She was extraordinarily sweet and compassionate. Parents and students alike loved her. Different grades had different recess times at Warwood. Pre-K through second grade had it at 11:30 through 12, and third through fifth had it at 12 through 12:30. Our playground was massive, despite our small classes. The main playground island had a slide, a bridge, ladders, monkey bar, and a huge plastic rock dome with little dinosaur bones on the ceiling beneath it. It was the Dino Dome, as we called it. Tony and I would meet up there with Scotty and Phil, our friends from second grade. Both Scotty and Phil had older siblings. Scotty's brother was in fourth grade, and Phil's sister was in fifth. Both had attended Warwood since pre-K. Sometime during my first grade year, I remember a rumor went around about the bad chair, and Scotty was positive that his brother Mark had been sent to it. I first heard of the bad chair at lunchtime, right after recess. I think a boy named Eddie mentioned it to me in a hushed tone. "Alex, you know about the bad chair?" I shook my head. Many of my responses to adults and children alike were motions instead of words. I was rather shy. "You want to know about the bad chair?" I nodded. "Okay, you know the teacher's place near the girls' potty room?" The teacher's place was a small break room, or staff room for teachers. Small place, probably had a fridge and a bathroom. I nodded again. "Well, some kid says he's seen inside there. He says there's another door." Impossible, I thought. No child, living or dead, had seen into the teacher's place. "How'd he see it?" I asked, unbelieving. "He had to go to the potty on his way back to Mrs. Tudor's class. He saw a teacher go in. When the door opened, he says there was a table, chairs, and another door." So that's where the bad chair is." "I still don't know what that is." "You know J-Boy?" J-Boy was a very misbehaved fourth grader. Everybody knew who he was. Just that week, he'd been expelled for bad behavior. "Uh-huh. Remember how he messed up Mrs. Ludke's desk last week? And then how he used his Boy Scout stuff to set all the tests on fire?" "Uh-huh. Well, he got something worse in detention." "Well, yeah, he got kicked out." Eddie giggled condescendingly. "That's what they want you to think." "They?" "The teachers. J-Boy doesn't even live here anymore. He lives at the hospital now." "Why?" "The bad chair. Of course, Then lunch was over, leaving me with an undying curiosity about the bad chair. I think that was a Friday. So after the weekend came and went, I met up with my pals in the Dino Dome and asked if they had heard about the bad chair and J-Boy's fate. Someone told me about that. I think it's a big fat fib, Tony announced, crossing his arms. Eddie told me a little, but he had to go when he reached the good stuff. What is the bad chair? Then from the side of the Dino Dome, the bald head of Steve peeked in. Steve was a 5th grader who was really sick and was allowed 2 recesses. You guys talking about the bad chair? It was extremely rare for a 5th grader, even a special one like Steve, to talk with the likes of 1st graders. We all froze, stunned to have his attention. You better not let the teachers hear. Why not? Phil squeaked. They might get sent there. Steve scanned the playground and crept inside the Dino Dome. And who knows what'll happen after that. What is the bad chair, you guys? I was quite flustered at this point, just wanted to know what the darn thing was, true or not. It's beneath the school. You can only get to it through a door in the teacher's lounge. Yeah, the 5th graders called the teacher's place a lounge. Far too fancy for our taste. And what's it do? I inquired. Bad things. Well, duh. My friends gasped. No one talked to 5th graders like that. Steve, however, didn't seem to care. He once again looked outside of the Dino Dome as if to make sure no teachers were around. You guys know about J-Boy, right? Yeah, we replied simultaneously. He's a hero. If it weren't for him, none of us would know about the bad chair. He's been here a long time, but he's the first one to escape it. Escape it? Yup. After J-Boy did all that bad stuff, everyone in Ludke's class saw him get sent out to the principal's office. Not really. Ludke took him into the lounge, and whoever was in the lounge took him down the stairs to the room with the bad chair. How do you know all this? Tony interrupted, still skeptical. He told his best friend Finn from my class about it before he went crazy. He said that the room they took him to was really dark, except for some candles on the floor. In the middle is the bad chair. It's wooden and has a bunch of leather straps that they tied him into. But on the top, where your head goes, there's a skull. A human skull? Phil shuddered. Steve frowned. No. No one said anything. Then what? I urged. Then they began. Began what? Dancing. I laughed, thinking this was all a build-up to a big joke. Steve just shook his head. Not funny dancing. Weird dancing. He said they twisted and bent in impossible ways. He said they were wearing black clothes. They were whispering. He screamed, but no one could hear him. He was too far down. How'd he get out? Tony finally looked a little unsettled. Something went wrong. Steve gulped, almost like he were there himself. Something joined them. Hello, boys. Mrs. Chandra, the recess attendant, stepped inside the Dino Dome. We all screamed. Mrs. Chandra jumped, startled by our cries, then laughed. Steve went pale. Paler than usual. Telling scary stories to the young ones, Stevie? Mrs. Chandra asked. Yes, ma'am. Chandra pursed her lips into a smile. Nothing too dark, I hope. Steve shook his head. None of us looked at her. Well, only 5 more minutes until the young ones go back to class. I suppose you'll be out here with the others, Stephen? Yes, ma'am, replied Steve almost robotically. Any more scary stories? No, ma'am. Good. Very good. With that, Mrs. Chandra patted one of us on the back and left. Steve looked like he was about to cry and ran out of the Dino Dome. We didn't see him again. The days following our talk with Steve were quiet and seemingly normal. Steve was absent, and most students said that was because of his frequent hospital visits. My friends and I suspected otherwise. Tony, however, raised some good questions regarding the J-Boy situation, though. Why weren't his parents doing anything about this? Surely somebody had told them about all the bad chair rumors. And if other kids had been sent to the bad chair, why didn't they remember? They couldn't have died or vanished, because people would notice the large numbers of disappearances and deaths. As the days passed, we learned more information about the bad chair. Sometimes by kids in our grade, but usually from 4th and 5th graders. Apparently, if the bad chair worked, you didn't remember any of it happening. That was what made the J-Boy thing so important. For the first time, something had gone wrong, and he remembered everything. Plenty of other kids had gone, they just didn't know it. Where the 4th and 5th graders received this intel is still unknown to me. A few months went by, and the talks of the bad chair and J-Boy died down. We were told by Princener Ebner that Steve had spent his last months in hospital fighting hard, but had sadly passed away from cancer. Tony concluded that the bad chair was nothing more than a scary story made up by the 5th graders to freak out us younger kids. We just about believed that, until the very last day of our 1st grade year. Summer was approaching fast, so naturally everyone was very excited. And with the excitement comes shenanigans, so to say. For that last day, our 1st grade class joined with Miss Lutke's 2nd grade class, and we all had a fun little pizza party. We were playing games, singing songs, telling stories, the usual. Then a 2nd grader named William ran through the classroom door, sobbing. He had left just a few minutes before to use the restroom. All the children looked upset and concerned for our classmate, but Miss Anderson and Miss Lutke just exchanged serious glances. Anderson was the first to approach him. "Will, sweetheart, what's wrong?" William could hardly stand up, and he had sobbed so hard that he had vomited a little bit onto the carpet. The other kids were grossed out by this, and upchucked their own pizza slices. Lutke called for assistance in cleanup while Anderson patted Will on the back and urged him to share what had upset him. "Steve! It's Steve!" he finally cried, eyes shut tight. "What?" Miss Anderson tightened her grip on the boy and tried to pull him out into the hall. He shrieked in protest and curled into the fetal position. One of the adults who had been called to the room, room mom, offered to call his parents. "Wait," said Miss Anderson. "Let's see if he calms down." The room mom looked a tad bothered by the response, but agreed to wait just a few more minutes. Miss Anderson asked William again what had happened. He finally opened his eyes, which seemed to have been shut for the entirety of his presence. Lutke attempted to distract the rest of us in vain. "I saw Steve. I saw Steve," whimpered Will, eyes red and swollen. "Steve who?" Anderson asked, knowing very well which Steve the child meant. "Dead Steve." The room fell silent for Will's sniffles and coughs. Lutke and the other adults escorted us from the classroom while Miss Anderson talked to Will. We all whispered amongst ourselves until we were ordered to remain quiet until our parents arrived. The end of the day had come, and oddly enough, none of us wanted to leave. We needed to know what Will saw. None of us found out, that is, until 2nd grade year started. I haven't much to say about that summer, except that most nights were spent wondering about Will, Steve, and the bad chair. I would ask Tony if he had heard anything, and he'd ask Phil, who would ask Scotty, but no one had. Day 1 of 2nd grade, Tony and I met up and started asking around about William, who would now be in 3rd grade with Scotty and Phil. None other than Eddie, the same boy who first told me about the bad chair, provided us with the answers. "William doesn't go to school here anymore. He's being homeschooled, I think." "Why? What happened?" This conversation took place in the few minutes we had before class started. "He said that while he was taking a pee-pee, he heard weird squishy sounds and growling. When he opened up the door, Dead Steve was on the ground, wiggling about, only he wasn't dead. And he wasn't even Steve. How could Steve not be Steve? He was something else, too. Like what? I don't know. No one does. It's all I heard. Steve was both alive and something else. After that, Will started seeing a doctor, and now he's schooled at home." Miss Lutke, who was now our teacher, whistled and ordered us all to take our seats. She told us that students would no longer go to the bathroom by themselves, but would always bring a buddy. This was obviously because of the Steve and J-Boy incidents. During recess for the beginning of the year, Mrs. Shaunder would poke her head into the Dino Dome quite often, even when my pals and I weren't hanging around there. She started doing it so much that we stopped going there altogether and instead walked around the playground at a steady pace if we needed to talk. One day, Scotty said that his older brother, who was now in 5th grade, had been sent to detention for cheating on a test. Scotty asked him what detention was like. Caleb, his brother, said he didn't remember. Said he fell asleep or something. Scotty began crying, and started bringing up the bad chair. Mrs. Chandler saw us. "He doesn't feel well," I told her, when asked what the tears were about. Scotty held his tongue and went along with it. Mrs. Chandler asked if he'd like to see the nurse, offering to walk him back. Scotty refused, but began to cry harder. Then recess ended. Mrs. Chandler guided us back to class. Then we saw her go into the teacher's place down the hall. Now this I remember clearly. Just 2 rooms down, the kindergarten class was having nap time. We were having a math lesson. Miss Ludke was talking about basic fractions or something when all the lights went out. We heard screaming and crying. Lots of it. Ludke ran out of the room, leaving us with her assistant named Rachel, who told us to remain calm. About 3 minutes passed before the lights came back on. The screaming and crying had lasted without a single pause for the entire period of darkness. When light returned, they ceased almost immediately. It was the kindergartners, Miss Ludke told us. They were afraid of the dark. That wasn't even close to what the kindergartners at recess told us. The day following the power outage and screams at recess, my friends and I decided to ask some kindergartners what had caused them so much fright. Many kindergartners were not at school that day, but we managed to find a few who all told an extremely similar story. For the sake of readability, I will change the language and grammar they use to be more coherent. The accounts that follow are obviously not how kindergartners talk, but rather how I edited them. All the details are exactly as they said, just touched up. First we asked a blonde girl. I don't recall her name. "Before nap time started, Miss Natasha prayed for us." This was already a bizarre thing to hear, as our school was non-religious. Parents had gotten into fits over any mention of religious activity or were influenced by teachers. "She wasn't praying to God. She was praying to something else. I can't pronounce it. It didn't sound like English. She mentioned Steve, dead Steve, and J-Boy, and it made us feel weird, like tingly, sleepier than we were before. I don't know how long we were asleep before something came." "What came?" The girl started trembling and looked like she was about to cry, but in an instant she calmed down, even smiled a bit. "It was beautiful," she said. "So beautiful." She didn't say much else, but another kindergartner did. "Miss Natasha prayed for us before nap time started. I started feeling odd after she mentioned Steve and J-Boy and something else. I don't know how to say it. It was weird, but I got sleepy real fast. I saw my friends close their eyes, but I fought to keep mine open because I wasn't sleepy before, and I kind of had to pee. I pulled my blanket over my head so Miss Natasha wouldn't notice I was awake." The kid had a particularly blank stare and expressionless face. We had found him sitting by the swing set, not doing anything at all. I heard the classroom door open, and Miss Natasha walked out. I could tell because I heard her heels clicking against the floor. I took off my blanket, and then something joined. "What? What joined?" I snapped, having had the answer taken away last time. "It knew I was awake. It didn't want me to be awake. I shouldn't have been awake." The boy's pace started to increase. It was hard to catch every word. He was not in a state of panic like the other child, though. It stood above me, stood right above me. A heavy weight was on me, but I knew it wasn't touching me. I was scared. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I didn't cry, and I should have been asleep, and I couldn't understand anymore after that. We talked to one more kindergartner, and his name I remember. His name was Joshua L. He had tennis ball friends. You know the tennis balls they cut open and put on the legs of chairs? Yeah, he took those off and drew eyes on them and talked to them. We saw him do it at recess a lot. Anyway, we talked to him, and every time he said something, he moved the mouths of his tennis ball friends. "We were getting ready to sleep when Miss Natasha said a prayer for us. Her God is a funny name, and he cares about dead Steve and Jay. I got all warm and jingly, so I closed my eyes to sleep, and then I slept." "And then something came," Tony interjected. Joshua put one of his tennis balls right in Tony's face. Yes, something did. I know this because we all woke up and the lights were off. Miss Natasha had left them on. I didn't know where she was. Then we all screamed. All of us. At first, we didn't know why. Not even me. I was screaming and I didn't even know why. I screamed until it hurt. I felt like I had to. No teachers came in to check on us, no matter what they said. We were alone with something. It touched all of us, one by one. It knew my name. None of us said anything. Then Joshua said something. It was unpronounceable. And then he smiled, and recess was over. No kindergartners told their parents what had happened. No one else asked, or if they did, they didn't say. Just me, Tony, Scotty, and Phil knew what Josh and the others had said. School continued like normal. For years. Anticlimactic, right? Nope. I don't think things were actually normal. Because I found something out just 3 days ago. My mom told me a story about my second grade year that I didn't remember. She said my friends and I had drawn nasty stuff on our teacher's whiteboard. She said we got sent to detention for that. I don't remember that at all. I know what happened. Only one explanation. We didn't draw stuff on the whiteboard. We didn't get sent to detention. We got sent somewhere else. We took a seat in the bad chair. And whatever happened there worked. All my memories of the rest of second grade and third grade and fourth grade cannot be trusted. I returned to Augusta, Georgia to find Warwood. Instead, I found a different school in this place, which for their sake I will not name. The building, though, was same as Warwood, was refurbished and painted differently. I entered the school and asked the front desk about its history, explaining that I used to attend the school when it was called Warwood. Oh, yes, Warwood. It was renamed after the management change in '04. Management change? Yes, most of the original staff quit or relocated rather abruptly to many different places. DuPont, Fayetteville, D.C., Firebroker, Philly. I paused. Was any reconstruction done to the interior? My eyes glanced down the hall where the teacher's lounge had originally been. No, I don't think so. Why? I just have some fuzzy memories in one room. I'd like to clear them up. I'm afraid I can't let you into any of the rooms without special permission. That's okay, I understand. But would you happen to know if any of the old teachers from Warwood still work here? Just one, I believe. Who? Natasha Tuger. She still teaches kindergarten. Did she teach you? Not me personally, but I do remember her. Would you like to speak with her after school? The day ends in about an hour. Yes, I would appreciate that. Thanks. I took a seat outside the office and browsed on my phone. The woman at the front desk had called Natasha's room and informed her that she had a visitor. What's your name, sir? She asked me. Alex. His name is Alex. He's a former student. Some brief conversation passed, and then she hung up. Natasha remembers you. She's very excited to see you. Good. I smiled. My heart was skipping beats, and I felt nauseous, but I did my best to hide it. I excused myself to the restroom, which was exactly where I remembered it. I recalled the story about Dead Steve appearing in this very bathroom, and I knew the teacher's lounge was just a room over. I did my business, and as I washed my hands, a child entered. Hello, said the boy. Hello, said the boy. Hey. I'm good with children. The children I know, that is. At this point, I was afraid of being labeled a pervert who spoke with children in an elementary restroom, however, and did my best to avoid saying much of anything. But kids these days can be very social, and this one was. Are you someone's daddy? Nope. Why wasn't this boy even going to the bathroom? He was standing outside the stalls, watching me wash my hands. You look like someone's daddy. Okay. I dried my hands and awkwardly waved goodbye. The boy remained still, staring. As I left the restroom, I looked to my left and saw the door to the lounge. The door had been redone and was far fancier now. It even said Teacher's Lounge on the window. Very cliché. I casually strolled by and looked inside with my eyes corners. I didn't see anyone. Then I got a bad idea. I decided to test the doorknob. It was unlocked. So I went inside. fridge, coffee table, sink, staff restroom, chairs, door. The same door I had seen glimpses of in my time at Warwood. I did a precautionary check behind me, confirming that no teachers were heading inside, not that I'd be able to avoid them anyhow. Then I returned my attention to the door. It was now or never, I supposed. I approached it with a trembling hand and twisted the doorknob. It creaked open exactly how you'd imagine an old door would. I peered into a dark staircase that descended straight downward. Cold air washed over my face and my head began to throb. I took a step inside and the throbbing grew worse. It did with every step down. There was no light I could see at the bottom, yet I continued with my phone screen as a guide. The pain in my head stretched down to my spine. My body knew I had been here before, and whatever happened wasn't good. As I reached the bottom of the stairwell, I spotted a light switch on the right with my phone. I flicked it on, not knowing what to expect. Boxes. Lots of boxes. And shelves. No bad chair, no candles, no satanic symbols or skeletons or pictures of children. Despite this, my head and back still ached. "Welcome back, Alex." Natasha stood on the bottom step, smiling and dressed in a floral gown. "I'm leaving. Out of my way." I did not know how threatening I sounded, though I did try. "Open up a box, Alex." I said move. I walked forward with fists balled, but she did not care. She did not even look at me. She looked behind me, her grin wider. "What the hell did you do to me in here?" I had broken. I had given in and asked. She knew I was afraid. She had leverage. Natasha said the same thing that girl in kindergarten class had said. "It was beautiful. So beautiful." Then she pointed to the storage boxes. "Take a look." No. Yes, I wanted to, or at least something inside me wanted to, but I refused. Tony, Scott, Phil, they came back too. "Shut up!" Natasha moved past me, very gently, as though walking on air. I wanted to burst up the stairs, but something held me back. She knelt down by a rather large box to the right of the room and opened it. It had not been sealed. She stuck her entire left arm inside of it and grunted as she lifted an object out. As soon as I saw it, I fell to my knees. I remembered it, just barely. The skull, not of a human, and of no animal I had ever seen. I was frozen in place. Pain in my body was now so extreme that I wish I had a way to kill myself. Natasha spoke, but it was unpronounceable. Then she placed the skull on top of my head. In my mind, I saw them all. The teachers dressed in black, the candles, the bonds on my wrists and ankles, the robed ones. The way they moved, the way they bent, their faces distorted beyond imagination. The shaking of the ground beneath me, the freezing blast of wind from somewhere else. Then they all shrieked and bowed. In the corner I saw Tony and Phil and Scotty. They were sobbing and vomiting. Their eyes rolled back in their heads. I returned to the moment at hand and watched Natasha die. That demented bald boy with something on him was tearing at her flesh. Dead Steve. My eyes closed, and I heard the screams of kindergartners, the prayers of Natasha, the songs of the faculty, the unpronounceable. I remembered all those days at school after I had taken a seat in the bad chair. My throne. The hours spent being worshipped, the plans, the visions, unpronounceable entering children, entering me. It didn't always work. Dead Steve, J-Boy. But when it did work, worked well. There's a little piece of something everywhere. He left me for a while, but he's back now. He always comes back. To all of us. There's nothing that can be done about it. Everyone will sit down. Everyone will be someone.
That's the end of the story. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our future stories.